In the shadowed world of Southern California's prison-based power structures, names carry weight long before faces are ever seen. One of those names is Albert Puppet Vargas, also known as Alberto Vargas or simply Beto. To law enforcement, he would later be described as a significant operational figure within the Mexican Mafia, known on the streets and inside correctional institutions as La M. But long before indictments, federal task forces, or whispered orders, Vargas's story began in a far more ordinary place, Baldwin Park, California. In the late 20th century, Baldwin Park was a working-class city shaped by industrial jobs, tight neighborhoods, and long-standing street rivalries. Like many young men raised in that environment, Vargas gravitated toward a local neighborhood crew. At this stage, there was nothing to suggest national notoriety or future headlines, only the familiar rhythm of street-level affiliations, loyalty to peers, and the slow pull toward a more structured criminal identity. What separated Vargas from many others was not speed, but adaptability. As street activity increasingly intersected with incarceration, the center of gravity shifted from neighborhoods to cell blocks. Inside California's prison system, influence did not come from charisma alone. It came from discipline, reliability, and a willingness to place the organization above the individual. Vargas learned this early. While others faltered under pressure, he absorbed the rules, internalized the hierarchy, and demonstrated that he could be trusted. Within the Mexican Mafia, trust is currency. La M is not a loose association. It is a rigidly controlled organization built on secrecy, codes of conduct, and consequences for violations. Advancement is slow and deliberate. Members are observed for years, sometimes decades, before being entrusted with meaningful responsibility. Vargas's rise from a neighborhood-level background into the orbit of high-ranking figures marked him as someone who understood this reality and embraced it. By the time Vargas began to be recognized beyond Baldwin Park, his reputation was no longer tied to the streets. It was tied to execution of orders, communication, and the ability to function as part of a larger machine. Inside prison walls, where information is tightly controlled and mistakes are costly, Vargas proved effective at navigating layered command structures. This is where his nickname, Puppet, takes on deeper meaning. To outsiders, the moniker might suggest control by unseen hands. Inside La M's world, however, it hinted at something more complex. Someone capable of pulling strings, relaying instructions, and ensuring that directives moved smoothly from leadership to those expected to carry them out. Vargas was not known as a public figure. He operated in the background, where influence is quieter, but often far more dangerous. As his standing grew, so did his proximity to established leadership. Veteran figures within the Mexican Mafia began to rely on Vargas as a messenger and facilitator. These were not ceremonial roles. Messages carried within La M are precise, deliberate, and often time-sensitive. A single misunderstanding can trigger internal conflict or unwanted attention from authorities. Vargas did not misunderstand. According to later federal filings, he became a trusted conduit for orders that shaped behavior across multiple facilities and street-level groups. This positioned him as what investigators would later describe as a power player, not because he sought visibility, but because others acted based on what he conveyed. In organized crime, visibility is often a liability. Vargas's ascent suggested a strategic mindset. Stay out of the spotlight, maintain loyalty upward, and enforce consistency downward. This balance allowed him to move comfortably between different layers of the organization, from incarcerated members to street-based affiliates operating under La Aim's influence. By the late 2000s, Vargas was no longer simply a participant. He was an operator. Law enforcement would eventually argue that he played a central role in maintaining discipline and order, ensuring that rules were followed and violations addressed. But at this stage in the story, those allegations were still forming, quietly accumulating in investigative files while Vargas continued to operate largely unseen. The foundation had been laid. From Baldwin Park to the inner corridors of one of America's most tightly controlled criminal organizations, Albert Puppet Vargas had positioned himself exactly where La M valued its most dependable figures, close enough to power to shape outcomes, distant enough to avoid unnecessary exposure. What came next would pull him out of the shadows and place him squarely in the crosshairs of a sweeping federal case that aimed to dismantle the organization he had helped serve. To understand Albert Puppet Vargas's true significance, it is necessary to understand the organization he served and the machinery that kept it running. The Mexican Mafia, known internally as La M, is not merely a prison gang. It is a long-standing criminal organization that uses incarceration as its command center. While members exist on the streets, authority flows outward from correctional institutions, where senior figures issue directives that ripple through entire regions of Southern California. Control is not maintained through chaos, but through structure. At the top sit veteran members whose names are rarely spoken outside closed circles. Beneath them is a carefully arranged network of trusted intermediaries, individuals tasked with carrying instructions, enforcing compliance, and ensuring that the organization's rules are followed without question. These intermediaries do not improvise. They execute. By the late 2000s, Vargas had become one of these intermediaries. Federal investigators would later describe him as a figure entrusted with managing operations and spreading orders on behalf of higher-ranking leadership. In practical terms, this meant Vargas functioned as a living transmission line, moving information between decision-makers and those expected to act. This role required precision. Inside prison walls, communication is monitored, restricted, and deliberately obscured. Messages are passed through coded language, indirect references, and trusted human couriers. A mistake can expose leadership, compromise operations, or invite retaliation from within. Vargas's continued use in this role suggests he demonstrated consistency under pressure. He was not improvising authority. He was delegated authority. Vargas's influence extended beyond a single facility. According to later court documents, his reach touched multiple institutions and connected directly to street-level gangs operating under La M's umbrella. These gangs, while maintaining their own identities, were expected to follow the broader directives of the Mexican Mafia. Compliance ensured protection and access. Disobedience carried consequences. Vargas helped ensure those consequences were understood. One of the most important relationships in Vargas's ascent was with Peter Sana Ojeda, a veteran Mexican Mafia leader whose influence stretched back decades. Ojeda represented the old guard, figures who had survived internal conflicts, law enforcement scrutiny, and shifting power dynamics within California's prison system. For Ojeda to rely on Vargas was not accidental. According to federal allegations, Vargas served as an enforcer and messenger for Ojeda. This placed him in a sensitive position, relaying orders that could alter alliances, settle disputes, or escalate tensions. The closer one operates to leadership, the less room there is for error. Ojeda's trust in Vargas reflected more than loyalty. It reflected confidence. Confidence that Vargas would deliver messages accurately. Confidence that he would not overstep. Confidence that he understood when to speak and when silence was required. Within La M, those distinctions can determine survival. At this stage, Vargas was operating at the intersection of policy and enforcement. He was not drafting rules, but he was ensuring they were applied. This included monitoring behavior, addressing perceived violations, and reinforcing the organization's code of conduct. That code governed everything from communication with outsiders to media exposure. In the Mexican Mafia's worldview, attention is dangerous. Public visibility risks exposure, invites scrutiny, and weakens the organization's ability to operate quietly. Members are expected to maintain discipline at all times, whether inside or outside custody. Deviations are not treated as personal choices. They are treated as threats to collective security. This emphasis on discipline would soon bring Vargas into one of the most controversial allegations associated with his name. But before that moment, it is important to recognize how Vargas's position reflected a broader organizational strategy. By empowering intermediaries like him, La M insulated its leadership. Orders could be denied, reinterpreted, or distanced if necessary. Responsibility flowed downward while authority remained concentrated at the top. Vargas operated comfortably within the system. He did not seek public credit. He did not cultivate notoriety. His effectiveness lay in his ability to function as part of a coordinated structure, one that blurred the lines between incarceration and street activity, between individual action and collective intent. By the end of the decade, federal agencies had begun paying closer attention to these intermediaries. Investigators understood that dismantling La M required more than arresting visible figures. It required mapping the connective tissue, the messengers, the enforcers, the quiet operators who kept the system alive. Albert "Puppet" Vargas was firmly on that map. And as scrutiny intensified, a single incident would thrust his alleged role into sharper focus, an event that demonstrated just how far an order could travel and how quickly consequences could follow. By the end of 2010, federal investigators were already tracking the internal communications of the Mexican Mafia with increasing urgency. What they were uncovering suggested not only a highly disciplined organization, but one capable of reacting swiftly to perceived threats, especially those involving exposure. That threat, according to prosecutors, arrived on December the 25th, 2010. On that day, Albert "Puppet" Vargas allegedly issued an order that would later become one of the most cited elements of the 2011 federal racketeering case. The directive, as described in court filings, targeted inmates from Orange County who had appeared on the MSNBC television series Lockdown. From the organization's perspective, participation in the show represented a serious violation. Lockdown offered viewers an inside look at prison life, featuring inmates speaking openly on camera. While the show was produced with institutional approval, the Mexican Mafia's internal rules operate independently of official prison policies. Any interaction with media, particularly one that could draw attention to incarcerated members, was viewed as reckless. According to the indictment, Vargas claimed that the inmates who appeared on the show had violated the code of conduct. Within La M's framework, such a violation demanded a response. Federal prosecutors alleged that Vargas's order called for violence against all Orange County inmates who had appeared on lockdown. The order was reportedly disseminated rapidly through prison channels, moving from inmate to inmate, facility to facility, with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. What followed, according to investigators, was immediate. Within a week of the alleged directive, multiple assaults were reported inside California correctional facilities. While individual incidents varied, prosecutors argued that the timing and pattern aligned with the order attributed to Vargas. The attacks were not random. They were targeted, coordinated, and reflective of an organization enforcing discipline. To law enforcement, this was a turning point. For years, federal agencies had suspected that La M maintained centralized control, but proving it was difficult. Orders were rarely written, communications were fragmented, responsibility was often diffused across multiple actors. The lockdown incident, however, presented something different. A clear trigger, a defined group of targets, and a narrow window of resulting activity. Investigators began reconstructing the chain. They examined how information moved inside prisons, who had the authority to issue such directives, and who was capable of ensuring compliance across multiple locations. In that reconstruction, Vargas's name surfaced repeatedly, not as a lone actor, but as a key transmission point. Prosecutors would later argue that Vargas was not acting independently. Rather, he was operating within the authority granted to him by senior leadership. Whether acting on standing rules or under specific instruction, the effect was the same. Discipline was enforced swiftly and decisively. The lockdown order also highlighted the Mexican Mafia's deep concern with image control. Unlike street gangs that sometimes seek notoriety, La M values invisibility. Media exposure threatens that invisibility. The show's national platform meant that prison activity, normally contained within concrete walls, was suddenly visible to millions. For the organization, that visibility carried risks far beyond embarrassment. It invited scrutiny. The alleged response was intended to send a message, not just to those who appeared on camera, but to everyone watching from inside. Participation in media, cooperation with outsiders, or actions that could attract attention would not be tolerated. From a narrative standpoint, this moment marked a shift in Vargas's story. Until now, he had been a background figure, important, but largely unseen. The lockdown allegations placed him at the center of an event that illustrated how much influence a single intermediary could wield. An order, allegedly spoken or passed along quietly, had resulted in real-world consequences across an entire region. For federal authorities, it validated years of investigative theory. If Vargas could issue or transmit such a directive, then he represented more than just another member. He represented the mechanism by which leadership maintained control while remaining insulated from direct involvement. The pressure began to mount, surveillance intensified, communications were scrutinized, investigators expanded their scope, looking not only at Vargas's actions, but at the relationships that enabled them. In particular, attention turned back to veteran figures who might be directing enforcement from behind the scenes. The lockdown incident was not an isolated episode. It was part of a larger pattern, one that pointed toward internal enforcement, centralized authority, and a willingness to act decisively when rules were broken. As 2011 approached, federal prosecutors were preparing something unprecedented in scope. Nearly 100 individuals, a sweeping racketeering case, and a public effort to expose the inner workings of the Mexican Mafia's control over Southern California. At the center of that storm stood Albert "Puppet" Vargas, no longer operating in the shadows, but facing allegations that would define his legacy within both the criminal underworld and the federal justice system. While the alleged lockdown order drew outside attention, the most dangerous threats to the Mexican Mafia have historically come from within. Loyalty is absolute, but power is never static. As senior members age, face isolation, or lose operational reach, Younger or more ambitious figures often see opportunity. By 2010, those pressures were quietly building inside LAM. At the center of this internal tension was Peter Sana Ojeda, a long-established leader whose influence dated back decades. Ojeda represented continuity, someone who had survived previous cycles of conflict, law enforcement crackdowns, and internal realignments. But longevity inside an organization, like the Mexican Mafia, can also create vulnerability. According to federal investigators, Ojeda believed that another member, Armando "Mando" Moreno, was attempting to seize power. Moreno, prosecutors alleged, was positioning himself as an alternative authority figure, someone capable of challenging Ojeda's standing and reshaping the hierarchy. In LAM's rigid structure, such ambition is not debated openly. It is treated as an existential threat. This is where Vargas re-enters the story. Federal filings allege that Ojeda instructed Albert "Puppet" Vargas to spread a green light order against Moreno. Within LAM's lexicon, a green light represents authorization for violent action. It is not issued casually, and once communicated, it carries the weight of organizational approval. Vargas's role, according to prosecutors, was not to question the order, but to transmit it. This again highlights why Vargas mattered. Leadership did not act directly. Instead, it relied on trusted intermediaries who could move information efficiently while preserving plausible distance. Vargas was seen as someone capable of delivering such messages without distortion, hesitation, or deviation. The alleged green light order also underscored how LAM polices itself. External rivals are only part of the equation. Internal challenges are treated with equal, if not greater, severity. The organization's survival depends on unity, hierarchy, and unquestioned authority. Anyone perceived as destabilizing that structure risks being labeled a threat, regardless of prior loyalty or service. For Vargas, operating in this environment required careful navigation. On one hand, proximity to leadership increased his influence. On the other, it placed him closer to the organization's most volatile decisions. Internal enforcement carries unique risks. Unlike street-level actions, these conflicts unfold in confined environments where allegiances shift quickly and mistakes are unforgiving. Federal investigators argued that Vargas's alleged involvement in spreading the green light demonstrated how deeply he was embedded in the Mexican Mafia's enforcement apparatus. He was not merely responding to violations, he was participating in the resolution of power struggles at the highest level. This internal conflict also fed directly into the broader federal case. By documenting disputes between Ojeda and Moreno and Vargas's alleged role as a messenger, prosecutors sought to show that LAM functioned as a cohesive organization with clear leadership, defined rules, and mechanisms for enforcing compliance. It wasn't chaos. It was governance. From the outside, the Mexican Mafia is often portrayed as violent and unpredictable. From the inside, however, it operates with a grim logic. Authority must be maintained. Challenges must be neutralized. Orders must be followed. Vargas's alleged actions, prosecutors argued, fit perfectly within that framework. As these internal dynamics unfolded, federal agencies were finalizing what would become one of the largest racketeering cases in California history. The goal was not just to arrest individuals, but to expose the organization's command structure, its leaders, its intermediaries, and the invisible lines connecting them. By early 2011, those lines had been mapped, names were compiled, roles were defined. Evidence was assembled to demonstrate how orders flowed from senior figures through messengers like Vargas, and outward to those who carried them out. When the indictment came down, it would tie together years of investigation, surveillance, and analysis, placing Vargas firmly within the narrative of La M's internal governance and enforcement. The walls were closing in. By 2011, the quiet architecture that had sustained the Mexican Mafia for decades was under unprecedented pressure. Federal investigators were no longer focused on isolated incidents or individual crimes. Instead, they were preparing to confront the organization as a single criminal enterprise, one defined by hierarchy, discipline, and centralized authority. The result was a sweeping federal racketeering indictment. Nearly 100 individuals were named in what prosecutors described as a coordinated effort to dismantle La M's control over Latino street gangs in Southern California, particularly in Orange County. The indictment outlined a system in which orders flowed from senior leadership inside prisons to street-level gangs outside, enforced through fear, loyalty, and carefully selected intermediaries. Albert "Puppet" Vargas was among those named. For federal authorities, Vargas represented a crucial piece of the puzzle. He was not portrayed as a symbolic figure or a marginal participant. Instead, prosecutors described him as someone trusted to manage operations, transmit orders, and enforce organizational discipline. His alleged involvement in the lockdown directive and the internal green light dispute was used to illustrate how authority was exercised without direct exposure from top leadership. The charges were serious. Vargas faced allegations including racketeering conspiracy and violent crimes in aid of racketeering, charges designed not only to punish individual acts, but to demonstrate participation in an ongoing criminal enterprise. Under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, prosecutors did not need to prove Vargas committed every act attributed to La M. They needed to show that he knowingly participated in the organization's affairs. The indictment argued that he did exactly that. For the Mexican Mafia, the case marked a turning point. The federal government had effectively pulled back the curtain, presenting a detailed narrative of how La M operated, how it communicated, enforced rules, resolved internal disputes, and maintained control across institutional and geographic boundaries. For Vargas personally, the shift was profound. The operational anonymity that had once protected him was gone. His name, once circulated quietly within prison corridors, was now part of a public legal record. The very discretion that had made him valuable to the organization could no longer shield him from scrutiny. In many ways, the RICO case underscored the paradox of Vargas's rise. He had advanced by being dependable, precise, and invisible. Yet it was that very reliability, his repeated presence in moments of enforcement and communication, that allowed investigators to place him at the center of their narrative. Vargas was not accused of being reckless. He was accused of being effective. As the case moved forward, it sent a message far beyond the courtroom. To La M's remaining members, it signaled that intermediaries were no longer safe from exposure. To street gangs operating under the organization's influence, it demonstrated that federal authorities were willing to pursue not just shooters or collectors, but the people who carried words from cell to cell. And to observers on the outside, it offered a rare glimpse into how modern organized crime survives, not through chaos, but through structure. Albert Puppet. Vargas's story is not one of sudden notoriety or flamboyant leadership. It is the story of how power functions quietly, how authority is delegated, and how organizations rely on individuals willing to place loyalty above visibility. In the end, Vargas stands as a case study in the machinery of the Mexican Mafia itself, not the figure at the top, not the one seeking attention, but the one who ensured that when orders were given, they were understood and acted upon.